So I know I don't do this very often, but here I am again with another non-EVE related video. For some of you that have been around quite a long time now, you'll know I do this every few months. This channel started as, and despite the general EVE theme, continues to be an outlet for the part of this whole process that is actually my passion: writing. Unfortunately, my creative inspiration to write opinionated stuff like this usually comes from a place of extreme frustration, and it's no different in this case from the discourse that has sprung up around a new release, Mixtape. I considered including its genre in that introduction: an indie game, a narrative adventure, a walking simulator, LGBTQ+, according to Steam's user-submitted categories, despite absolutely no LGBTQ+ content. But unfortunately, those labels are very much part of the discourse, so it would be a bit unfair for me to front-load them as presuppositions. What I am going to do first is provide the most unbiased plot summary possible. Don't worry, I'm not going to spoil any major events in the course of that description. If you do go on to play this game, you will come to realize that it's not really something you could spoil. Mixtape is not an edge-of-your-seat, complex, weaved web of story arcs, side plots, and world-changing decisions. I'd call it more of a sat back in your seat with a grin on your face game. Designed to be experienced in the moment, allowed to wash over you, not picked apart in great detail. And yet here we are, because unfortunately, there's a hell of a lot of conversations going on about this game, where both parties have obviously not actually played it to realize that. Regardless, watching this video will not and could not remove your ability to experience this game properly. It holds that unique ability by the very nature of how it's designed. The game's plot follows a trio: Stacy Rockford, who you spend the majority of the game playing as, Van Slater, and Cassandra Marino, trying to navigate the immense life transition that is the end of high school. Through a combination of beautiful stop-motion inspired animation and licensed soundtracks, you play through a series of mini-games and interactive environments in the form of flashbacks, while the group reminisces about their time together over the last few years. The soundtracks in particular are an incredibly prominent part of the game. This is a music-driven game, but not just from a game development perspective, also from a plot one. Rockford's post-high school plans are even more tumultuous than most. The day after the events of the game take place, Rockford plans to get on a plane to New York in an attempt to kickstart her dream career, being a music supervisor. She routinely breaks the fourth wall throughout the game to explain to the player some of the background information on upcoming soundtracks, why they suit the situation, and their overall significance as art to the wider medium of music. On this day, their final day together, supposed to culminate with a party held at the beach, Rockford has put together what she sees as the perfect soundtrack that will take them all the way from first meet through to their final goodbyes. This soundtrack plays such a prominent part of her way of navigating the world that it would be fair to say she's planned the day around this perfect soundtrack rather than the other way around. And that's it. It's not a particularly long game, around 3 to 4 hours and easily played in one sitting, perhaps even best played in one sitting, I would argue. It does an awful lot with that time, with great characterization that would be the envy of games even 10 times this length. There are of course trials and tribulations, insights into the other characters, and more in-depth explorations of Rockford's feelings about upending her life for her dream. There are a lot of themes to explore chapter by chapter: loss, friendship, sacrifice, maturing, creativity, introspection, loyalty, but I'll leave those as an exercise for the viewer to experience. It's better instead that we go on to some of the aforementioned discourse and why I'm making this video in the first place. Much like the last non-EVE video I made regarding the late High Guard and whether or not gamers really see games as art, much of this conversation going on around Mixtape right now directly questions its validity rather than interacting with any of its core themes or mechanics. What is to be expected though from the ramblings of people basing their entire opinion over a 10-second Twitter post about a game they haven't played, probably never will, so that Daddy Elon Musk can deposit $5 into their bank account for creating rage bait. First and foremost, there is a prominent conversation being had over whether or not Mixtape is truly a game, or just a movie. If this were an argument made in good faith, I would entertain it. There is no shortage of games that I feel touch on, or even massively stray into the medium of cinema. We would, as the name suggests, probably call those games cinematic. For example, I've recently been playing, in typical long overdue fashion, Red Dead Redemption 2. It shares an early game downfall, which I also felt in Death Stranding, one of my favourite games of all time now that I've completed it. Games which are cinematic first and interactive second are particularly susceptible to playing out like the worst edited movie you've ever watched. I wasn't recording it because I certainly didn't expect to bring it up in a video essay in the future, but very early in the single player story of Red Dead Redemption 2, you find yourself riding alongside a companion on horseback. Truthfully, you find yourself doing that for dozens of hours on end, but its simplicity grows on you, not unlike Death Stranding's walking. However, given you're so fresh to this experience and still piecing together what is, to be honest, a rather obscure and complicated controls layout, the cinematics that are supposed to really capture my interest and provide the hook for the rest of the game massively fall flat. The camera will be cutting between purely cinematic shots, points of view impossible from an immersion perspective, not that I particularly think that matters, I must add. So instead of focusing on the dialogue or the atmosphere, I'm watching the world's least capable cowboy plow his horse into a tree because I'm inexplicably still in control at that moment. Most games prioritize giving the player control and very clearly communicating times when the player is no longer expected to provide any input, while movies prioritize a viewing-only experience with few exceptions. Bandersnatch comes to mind, which very explicitly conveys that the viewer is now expected to make a choice, and you could certainly in good faith argue that Bandersnatch is more of a game too. But I'm not really convinced these arguments are in good faith. The narrative being presented about Mixtape right now is that it's somehow unique in this characteristic of having cinematic sequences, long stretches of gameplay where the player doesn't really have much, if any, control. I could go on a lengthy diatribe here about the 3-hour cutscene at the end of Death Stranding, which is in itself long enough to probably fit an entire playthrough of Mixtape, which doesn't get this kind of reception, but I digress. Some people have gone so far to put out this interpretation that a hoax has been started suggesting that the game is set for a limited theatrical release of a full recording of the entire game. People have been falling for that hook, line and sinker despite the news coming from the ever reputable eggplant emoji outlet. Now again, unlike most of the people having this conversation on Twitter, I can tell you with absolute certainty that this impression of Mixtape playing itself is absolute rubbish. The only way you could possibly think this is by watching one of the many maximum 1-minute clips taken from incredibly forgiving parts of the game, where mastering the gameplay elements of that minigame are rewarded with the reactions of the responsive environment, rather than enforced with the punishment of a fail state. You could do this for almost any game, honestly. If you, in a concerted effort to prove this point, go into pretty much any popular video game and just refuse to actually press the button that the game wants you to press, more often than not, you'll find that the game just reaches a state of equilibrium, where what was once frenetic action becomes just background noise of your companions shouting canned hurry up lines at you. Many will even go so far as to just kind of play the game for you. Certainly not a contemporary example, but one I like anyway. At the end of Fallout 3, you can just kind of walk along behind the towering anti-communist iron giant that is Liberty Prime, admiring the scenery, smelling the roses, and the NPCs will handle it all without your contribution. Think about the main quest in almost any open world game. So often, in an attempt to drive the story forward and keep compelling plot hooks, a sense of urgency is strongly instilled in the player. The idea that if you don't act on this soon, the world as you know it may cease to exist. A few decades ago, game developers weren't afraid to stand on business with this threat, soft-locking you for your tardiness, but now, in almost every case, you can just mess around doing side quests. Building your town in Goodsprings, collecting legendary animal pelts in New Hanover, delivering pizza in the post-apocalypse. So the fact that the game is lenient to your apathy at engaging with what it's trying to get you to engage with is far from unique even across a wide variety of genres. Unfortunately, there's a certain subset of people engaged in discussions like this who think that the games they play are the only real and valid games, usually within an incredibly strict criteria. Ironically, many of the people engaged in this discussion would probably disagree even with each other, but what's more important to them is that they can unite against games that they both see as beneath the medium. The biggest examples I see of this are those fixated with the classic gun and ball combination of games, whose only real exposure to the industry are yearly sports titles like FIFA, Madden, 2K, and the yearly FPS releases like Call of Duty or Battlefield. Or honestly, these days you could cast a much wider net over FPS releases, given the fall of those two's dominance, but that's definitely a conversation for another day. Another community guilty of this are those whose only experience with games revolves around open-world RPGs, Fallout 4, Skyrim, GTA 5, you could even kind of lump Dark Souls in with this community for having a very similar mindset. The idea of a game not having measurable and tangible stat progression is unthinkable to them. By absolutely no means am I saying that those games are lesser than something like Mixtape. Hell, my last non-EVE related video was me defending Highguard as art for 15 minutes, so that should give you an idea how open-minded I am on this topic. But just because something doesn't meet your preferences doesn't discount its value. Nor does it discount your opinion though. Something I majorly differ on compared to a lot of Mixtape's supporters trying to counter many of the points being made on Twitter and Reddit is this idea that people who don't like the game should shut up and move on, or just accept that they don't need to have an opinion on something they don't like. I don't necessarily agree with that, and I don't think it's really the answer to conversations like this. What I want instead is for these opinions to be actually specific and based on having actually played the game. Tim Kaine has an amazing YouTube channel where he's talked about this at length. Funnily enough, his comments have brought him too into the space of unemployed Twitter discourse lately. His recent video, How the Internet Changed Game Design, is a discussion on how frequently the online conversation around games has shifted away from the opinions of players pointing at specific mechanics or game elements that they don't like, and more towards the mass echoing of the opinions of social media influencers by people who've never played the game but need to know the trendy opinion to have at any given time. Even zooming in on games that are rightly or wrongly being compared to Mixtape, you can make this argument far more compellingly about some revered titles. Life is Strange, The Walking Dead, The Last of Us, Uncharted. Some are of course more like Mixtape than others, but what they all have in common is that they're primarily on-rails narrative pieces with an assortment of novel minigames designed to make you feel like part of the action. You absolutely could just watch a playthrough of these games. In fact, that's what I did for The Walking Dead 14 years ago now, watching Lamadia play through it. But you know what I did a few years later? I played the game myself. And the only way you can think that watching these games functions as a direct replacement for experiencing them yourself is if you never actually try them yourself to understand the difference. Michelle, the studio creative director for Don't Nod Entertainment, the studio behind Life is Strange 2, The Awesome Adventures of Captain Spirit, Lost Records Bloom and Rage, amongst many others, chimed in on this conversation saying, "Exactly, video games is a broad medium with so many depth genres and subgenres. Let's applaud the diversity it can offer rather than wanting to pigeonhole it in a specific subset or what gameplay should be. Interactivity is interactivity, be it Dear Esther or Dark Souls." I'm particularly inclined to listen to Michelle's comments in this case, as he is no stranger to the use of completely optional interactivity alongside a soundtrack to enhance immersion and evoke an emotional connection to a scene that is so much stronger than it would have been if you were just watching it with your hands behind your head. Another comment that I'm seeing a lot somehow in the year of our Lord 2026 is that the game is a walking simulator. For a certain subset of people around my age, a shiver probably just went down your spine when I said that phrase. This is a comment that comes around in cycles like some sort of game criticism El Nino, essentially focused on questioning the validity of games where the primary game mechanic is just walking from place to place, listening to dialogue, admiring the scenery, rather than constantly being tested on your reaction times or mechanical skill. Many different games have been labelled as such: Firewatch, Gone Home, Dear Esther, What Remains of Edith Finch. Another that comes up a lot, which I really need to play, is Everybody's Gone to the Rapture, almost certainly the only game ever to be based in my home county of Shropshire. A lot of the sting has definitely come off this label of walking simulator now though, as it's been quite willingly adopted by the communities that enjoy such games, including myself. I'm a big fan, for example, of The Hunter Call of the Wild, undoubtedly a candidate for the genre of walking simulator, but one in which I take a great degree of pleasure from just walking around. That one's not even a narrative-driven game really, but the fandoms of these kind of games aren't usually shy to admit the zen-like peace and tranquility that can be found in the walking simulator genre. Is Mixtape a walking simulator? It's tough to say. The term has evolved a lot over the years, and while it fits the bill in terms of exploration and low-pressure interactivity, I personally feel it lacks the travel as an experience vibe that comes to mind when I think of walking simulators. At the core of the genre is the idea that the act of moving from place to place is the meat of the game. but in truth most of the walking around in this game is either done within the tiny confines of a bedroom while you look at various knickknacks and Polaroids, or it serves as an accompaniment to Rockford's soundtrack of choice. Truly, who amongst us hasn't been walking somewhere with headphones on and a track from your playlist comes up with just the right beat to match your stride, and suddenly the world feels in harmony with you? That's at its core what this game is trying to achieve in every chapter, and where walking is used in limited amounts to match that vibe, I'm not sure it's enough to go into the walking simulator category. Ironically, not too dissimilar to evergreen discourse in the music community, a lot has been said about the game's status as an indie title, and to be honest, I actually don't mind this conversation. I think unfortunately a lot of the criticism about Mixtape's occasional categorization as indie is full of bile and vitriol rather than any actual open-minded interest, but it's a question that I think has no clear answer and shows the flaws in obsessively trying to label everything. To take a look at music, you'll get a lot of different answers on what constitutes indie depending on who you ask. For some, it is rigidly the concept of an artist releasing their work independent of a major record label. For others, it's a less concrete feel of music that is potentially rooted in earlier artists' freedom from the pressures of the music industry, but is now being replicated and adapted by plenty of big-name labels. Some would even define it by nature of its exposure or popularity within the mainstream, painting it as more of an ephemeral title that could be lost or regained entirely depending on the current zeitgeist. You'll find incredibly similar arguments happening around games. It's not especially rare for a friend to reach out to me recommending a new indie game, which on first glance checks all the boxes that I would describe as indicative of an indie title, but I later discover to be the product of a massive team with industry backing and that's massively popular. Now, I want to make it extremely clear that none of these impact my enjoyment or willingness to play a game, but it does bring into question what an indie game even is. I found this alignment chart on Reddit that was posted as a result of an argument about whether or not Baldur's Gate 3 is an indie game, and it gets the point across pretty well in the context of video games. I especially like the inclusion of Expedition 33 in this list, because despite absolutely not passing the indie game vibe check, it won Best Debut Indie Game at the Game Awards 2025. But why not? The game was made by about 30 developers, with the occasional assistance of others for the purpose of porting and QA testing. It was published by Kepler Interactive, a company explicitly formed as a collaboration between small indie studios and the company behind the publishing of the Pacific Drive, the game I reviewed in my first ever YouTube video as an aside. In stark contrast, the developer behind Megabonk, a game which absolutely passes the indie game vibe check, withdrew his nomination for the very same Best Debut Indie Game award on the basis that he had experience working at another major studio. Never mind the fact that Expedition 33's studio director and technical director were both former Ubisoft employees with experience working on The Division 2, Ghost Recon Wildlands, Tom Clancy's Ghost Recon Breakpoint, and Might and Magic Heroes 7. The reason Mixtape has been catching attention for this label though is mostly down to its publisher Annapurna Interactive, a division of Annapurna Pictures founded and led by Megan Ellison, the daughter of co-founder and former CEO of Oracle, Larry Ellison. I feel a bit sorry for Megan being characterized like this though. She has worked on projects with 4 Oscar Best Motion Picture nominations, Phantom Thread, American Hustle, Her, and Zero Dark 30, 2 of which were even nominated in the same year. Annapurna Interactive, more specifically, have been behind a litany of outstanding games: Kentucky Route Zero, Outer Wilds, What Remains of Edith Finch, Stray, and are co-publishing the upcoming Silent Hill Townfall. None of this is to defend Mixtape as an indie title, but I feel like it's the most basic level of human decency to acknowledge that Megan's time at the helm of Annapurna has been a mostly successful one, and that portraying her simply as an extension of her father is mostly patriarchal nonsense. Is the company supported by Larry? Yes. There have been well-publicized periods of financial difficulty for the company where Larry has become much more directly involved in the company's management, and undoubtedly its finances too. This only matters if we hold to that rigid definition of indie apart from major studios or labels. If that's how you personally define it, then sure, this game is not indie, but it does raise some important questions about attribution and the idea of selling out. As someone into punk and ska music, I'm very familiar with the friction that often exists between artists and the public around the concept of selling out. For anyone too young to experience that lower back pain that comes with any familiarity of Ska, there's a period of YouTube that followed a very similar blueprint. I vividly remember a period in the early 2010s where the idea of your favorite YouTuber having even a 20-second sponsor spot made them a sellout and a traitor in some way. We're past that now on YouTube, clearly, but the games industry doesn't quite seem to have caught up. We're stuck in this dissonance lately where if a game passes the indie sniff test, it can collect awards on this basis despite extensive and expensive teams with years of experience and backed by major corporate interests, while a game made by like a dozen people in Australia with 2 releases gets crucified for taking funding and distribution from a company with deep pockets. No matter how you define an indie title, take your definition, apply it to Mixtape, decide how you feel about it. I'm not trying to convince you it is or isn't, I'm just trying to say that it doesn't matter. And I think the people trying to act like Mixtape is some kind of industry plant, to steal from the hip-hop vernacular, are just desperately searching for a way to dismiss a game that they have no interest in playing as objectively bad. It feels lately like having a subjective opinion on a video game, movie, or TV show is some kind of failing reserved for those not cerebral enough to pay for X Premium, who clearly derive from the purchase some kind of perfect objective view of the world. Next on our list, and one that I keenly understand for reasons that will become obvious, the lack of a streamer mode for this game. This one made me laugh quite a lot because it, more than almost anything else I've read or seen lately, makes me feel so old. The fact that a streamer mode is something in consideration by video game developers and publishers shows quite how far we've come in the video game content creation space. It's possible that new gens may not be aware that there was a time not all that long ago where even showing gameplay of a video game was likely to put you in an adversarial relationship with the developer. Games would frequently have to post policies on their website about whether or not you were allowed to use gameplay footage on YouTube, and they would actually stand behind that policy and copyright claim even largely transformative works like open-world Let's Plays and machinimas. The fact that we have come so far from that time as to expect the developer to make an entirely secondary branch of their game without licensed music, just so streamers and content creators can keep their uploads unrestricted and monetized, is crazy to me. Of course, it's for that reason that you're not currently listening to Iggy Pop, Joy Division, or Smashing Pumpkins. I too do not want my uploads to be copyright claimed, and I pay to license the music I use in these videos specifically to avoid that happening. The studio responded to some of the backlash about this in a way that I think says it best. We've got a few questions about why Mixtape has no streamer mode. It's a fair question. Mixtape is about music. It's about Devo. It's about the Smashing Pumpkins and Lush and Alice Coltrane. It's about how you feel when you listen to Iggy Pop. The characters talk about the songs. The levels are designed around the songs. We couldn't change the songs. We couldn't replace them. We just couldn't. If you wanted to stream Mixtape and cannot because of this, we are truly sorry, but as David Gray says in Shine, your soul is the one thing you can't compromise, and music is the soul of Mixtape. Asking for a streamer mode in Mixtape would be like asking for a streamer mode in Guitar Hero. It kind of defeats the point. It wouldn't be impossible, of course. Hi-Fi Rush, another game almost entirely driven by music, has a prominently offered streamer mode. It is benefited by the fact that the game is already largely made up of in-house tracks, which the developer is not copyright claiming. But the segments where licensed music was very deliberately used are undoubtedly different, and potentially a worse experience with streamer mode switched on. People also need to acknowledge at some level that games aren't designed with streamers in mind. It's exactly this mindset that was behind the early industry adversarial relationship between YouTubers and video game developers. Especially for a game like this, easily played in 4 hours with a strict linear narrative and no branching storylines, developers are conscious that 1,000 people watching a playthrough of their game is potentially 1,000 people who would have otherwise bought it, who now won't need to. In reality, the proportion is almost certainly much less than that, but you can kind of understand where the logic comes in. I watch a lot of video essay and review content on YouTube that acts very entitled about this sometimes. The best example I can think of recently is a 4-hour review of Stranger Things Season 5. It's absolutely true that the tens of thousands of written words that comprise this video are transformative and without doubt belong to the uploader, Sheev Talks. But considering Stranger Things Season 5 is about 10 hours long, and the majority of this video features background video from the show, you can understand why this video got copyright claimed to hell and back by Netflix. That was admittedly quite a tangent, but all of that is to say that I think expecting games to owe you a streamer mode is quite frankly stupid. It harms the art and the message they are trying to get across, and it could make the game basically unplayable, and not even in the funny way like Life is Strange True Colors. Something else that is coming up a lot, completely blindsiding me again as someone who actually played the game, is this pervasive attitude that the game is wokeslop. As much as I'm a big fan of attaching the suffix slop to things, I got very confused by this take. I mentioned earlier in this video that the game had the LGBTQ+ user-submitted category tag on Steam, and I unfortunately think this points to a wider problem. Cards on the table, I'm a little fruity, and I enjoy a queer romance novel or games with queer themes, but this game doesn't have those themes. I think genuinely the only explanation I can come up with here is that the game certainly fits the vibe of many other games that do have such themes, and a lot of people have jumped to that assumption. It seems that woke and LGBTQ+ is a tag you can earn just by passing the Bechdel test in 2026, or is it that two girls held hands at one point? Honestly, if you're someone who thinks this game is too woke, please let me know in the comments how and why you came to that conclusion, because I am really struggling to understand. Cynically, I doubt it's much more than misogyny. The main trio and many of the side characters are predominantly female, and Slater, who is male, doesn't really ever bring up that fact, something that's normal to anyone who ascends from their basement more than once a week. He clearly shows romantic interest in girls and states that, but Cassandra and Stacy are just friends, again, a concept apparently alien to many of the game's wokeslop detractors. Not to expose my obsession with Life is Strange too much, but we saw very similar discussions around the release of the first in that series. In Life is Strange 1, you play as an 18-year-old Max Caulfield navigating the social minefield of Blackwell Academy, exploring through branching narratives and mysteries and the relationships you build along the way. One of the most viewed reviews of all time for that game is the Mad Maxine Life is Tumblr review, which reeks of the same kind of "ew, something with a female protagonist is popular" criticism that played a lot of media 10 to 15 years ago and is coming back into prominence again with the explosion of the manosphere. If you want to laugh at how sensitive some people are to this kind of thing, the Woke Content Detector Steam Curator group has some frankly hysterical reviews of games that would make an alien on their first day on Earth think that woke means not explicitly endorsed by the Bible. You've got gems like Counter-Strike 2, not recommended, contains overtly pro-DEI messaging, features multiple female agent skins including a female Navy SEAL and female SWAT officers. Viper is more muscular than most male operators. God forbid someone plays a girl in the same game that they spend half the match as an honest-to-God terrorist. Red Dead Redemption 2 got just an informational review of contains subtly pro-DEI messaging, several minor characters espouse modern-day political statements. As an example, the NPC Sadie Adler behaves the same way a modern-day feminist would. I'm surprised there's no mention of the women's suffrage NPCs in Saint Denis, but I suppose it would satisfy Woke Content Detector that you can hog-tie and rob them for daring to have such aspirations. It doesn't look like Mixtape has received a review by their curation page yet, which as it happens looks like it's probably been dead a couple of years, but misery loves company, so of course there's plenty of copycats. Modern Audience Detected reviewed the game with DEI, LGBTQ+, ACAB, woke, boring, millennial, nostalgia bait, theater kid, cringe, astroturfed, modern audience, game. The DEI in question presumably being the presence of black people in the 1990s, the LGBTQ+ elements being non-existent, and the ACAB element more so being a commentary on the counterculture of the characters, who are plainly intended to be young, immature, still working themselves out, and not really making any serious political commentary. We'll do a lightning round of a few more for fun. Warning, Sweet Baby Inc. levels of politics injected, pathetic 3 hours of nostalgia-chasing interactive movie, calling it a game is false advertising at best, funded by DEI-pushing billionaires. Oh yes, the famously DEI Zero Dark 30. It checks all the boxes to make it a woke game, and the game journos love it. These lesbian vibes from Life is Strange, I would be more careful with this project, may contain woke. I emphasize again that the only thing you could possibly interpret in this game as lesbian is two female characters talking to each other about their fondness for each other and what is set to be their last night together as friends. My favourite though is from the LGBTQ+ representation in gaming curator, who are actively trying to promote games with LGBTQ+ representation, saying, despite the advertising stating there's romance, there really isn't outside of a single heterosexual makeout scene in a flashback. Missed opportunity in my opinion, no gender or orientation rep. Even people who would probably wear the badge of woke proudly don't think this game is woke at all. Also, while we're on the topic of reviews, I really quickly want to put a particularly frustrating accusation out of its misery. If you think developers are paying games journalists for reviews, then maybe come play the game again after your 13th birthday or something. I can't believe that's something we're still seeing thrown around. IGN gave this a 10 out of 10 and people are losing their minds about it. I had this conversation in the High Guard video I did, so I'm not going to rehash it verbatim, but IGN isn't one person writing a perfectly balanced apples to apples review of every game ever released. It's a company full of a variety of writers who all have different opinions, including a weird aversion to cheese puns it turns out, and that is going to create inconsistent scoring, especially when you consider IGN has been around for almost 30 years now. If you think a 10 out of 10 review in 2026 is saying that Mixtape is better in every way than Skyrim's 9.5 in 2011, then you're going to have your mind blown when I tell you that LMFAO's party rock anthem isn't perpetually the second best song of all time just because it scored second in Billboard's 2011 Hot 100 chart. As it happens, I'm sure IGN don't particularly care if their review scores are consistently a source of inflammatory drama, because it's one of the few things that keeps IGN relevant in the ever-evolving, and some would argue shrinking industry of written games journalism. Editing Bill here, just jumping in because literally while I was editing this video, Harvey Randall at PC Gamer released a review giving Mixtape a 74 out of 100, with the tagline, "Lovely, beautiful, heartwarming, and unable to convince me it needed my input as a player at all." Which is perfect because it pretty much proves the point I'm trying to make here. In my last video I looked at YouTuber Kira losing it over a PC Gamer article by Tyler Wilde that showed High Guard in a positive light. I saw a tweet that said releasing this after the discourse is like the journalist equivalent of cheating on your homework, which made me laugh and certainly might be true. Just like the way IGN scores are designed to fan drama flames and get clicks, PC Gamer is playing in the same field, and it's very possible the decision to review it this way is part of that strategy. But equally, it really shows that games journalism isn't the massive monolith of paid actors that it's spent the last few days, weeks, maybe even years fighting off accusations for. Randall actually makes some great points in this article too. I suspect it would get the Tim Kaine seal of approval for actually giving specific feedback rather than much of the Twitter discourse just parroting the last thing they read, and there's a particular section I think is really interesting where Randall writes, "Mixtape fights with its existence as a video game more than it benefits from it. I kept thinking to myself, man, I would probably be more invested in this if I could just sit back and take it all in." This is exactly the point I was making earlier that hurts a lot of cinematic games. Someone in the comments even mentioned Red Dead Redemption 2. Do I agree? Not particularly. I personally think that Mixtape rides the line pretty well. I think if it added the mechanical interactions that much of Twitter wants, it would mess up the pacing of a lot of its carefully choreographed sequences. If it took away the mechanical interactions and just embraced being a movie, it would lose the immersion that the environment's responsiveness provides. But I am glad that someone is putting across a good faith argument about some of the points that got Twitter in a spin this week. Maybe next time people will keep this in mind when a completely different PC Gamer writer makes a point about a game that they don't personally agree with. That might be some wishful thinking. There are a couple of points I want to make still before we wrap up, one of which is a bit of a callback to that High Guard video from a few months ago. I have to admit I'm feeling really rather vindicated that I made some of the same points there which I'm about to make here, and this game feels like a much stronger bedrock from which to make the point and go, look, I'm not crazy. First of all, that the decision on whether or not games are art has clearly not been settled, not least within the gaming community. It's really rather settled in my mind. I have absolutely no doubt that games are art. But I admit that my threshold for art is incredibly low and captures basically anything in which human creativity was the primary source of what I'm looking at, regardless of the medium. I felt a bit silly making this argument about Highguard at the time. Don't misunderstand me, I did and still do believe that Highguard was, by my measure, art. But I can understand why it doesn't pass some people's litmus test for art. A live service, team-based shooter to many people really doesn't feel like it should be sharing space with the music of Mozart, the writing of Jane Austen, the landscapes of Rembrandt. But when you play Mixtape, or hell if you even watch it, I think it's hard not to see how it clears that bar. Even as detractors claim Mixtape is more movie than game, are movies too not art? The whole argument feels rather incongruous. It's fine to dislike Mixtape. Art is a subjective experience, but if we keep acting like our opinions on these things are objective, we take the risk of going into these experiences so closed-minded that we can never learn from the messages that art excels in conveying. There were many times playing Mixtape where I felt a nostalgia for a time I never experienced. Anemoia if you're into finding cutesy words for that kind of thing. I'm a bit old-fashioned for my age, no doubt. I still actively use cassette tapes now, but I only existed for 2 years in the 90s. That's not the point though. The message that Mixtape conveys isn't one that's locked in time or dependent on having skateboarded down a hill with your Discman. It's just one lens through which we can explore an experience that, if you are old enough, you probably went through something similar. If you're younger than the characters, that's probably going to change the way you receive this game a lot, but not necessarily in a bad way, just a different way. Everyone's had that last day with a friend who you spent years with, day in, day out, sometimes fully in the knowledge that you might not speak again for years, sometimes completely unaware that the era is coming to an end. Many can relate to the trepidation, anxiety, and excitement of leaving behind your hometown in pursuit of something that it can't offer you. You might not have experienced them in just this way, but you will find within this story dozens of tiny moments that you can relate to. But it is crucially by remaining open to these moments that you will occasionally be hit by something unfamiliar, something that broadens your perspective on an experience that you didn't have and may never have. Is it nostalgia bait? Maybe. There's no coincidence that the oddly named digital minimalism, physical media, and analog trends have been doing the rounds lately. As someone who spends minimum 8 hours a day looking at a screen courtesy of my job, I too am susceptible to the allure of a simpler, less digital life. But it's just an aesthetic, and there's nothing wrong with that. Every era besides the contemporary could be accused of nostalgia baiting through the same logic. Is every coming-of-age story a nostalgia bait for those in adulthood? Seems ludicrous to say out loud, but that's the kind of logic we're dealing with here. I'm honestly getting tired of every new game release being its own culture war. We've seen it lately with Marathon, Crimson Desert, Pragmata, Highguard, amongst many, many other smaller, more genre-specific controversies that didn't break containment in quite the same way. Contrarianism is at an all-time high. It's trendy to hate anything that tries something new while equally bemoaning the lack of variety in the games industry. Say it with me now, I am cringe, but I am free. Play the games you want to play, embrace a bit of whimsy, tell your friends about the games you like and the games you don't. All I ask is that you play them with an open mind and engage with them in good faith. That's what most people are doing. It's just a shame that the loud minority who rake in cash posting intentionally inaccurate rage bait are more likely to come to your attention than the honest review of a friend or someone with a similar interest and taste in games to you. The algorithm wants you to hate. It's profitable to hate. Don't let it win. If you want to help support the channel and you're a massive tabletop RPG nerd, which I know you are because I see my channel analytics, consider making your next purchase with DriveThruRPG, the largest RPG download store. Just a tip for you and you can thank me later, click Menu, My Account, and in the Additional Preferences section you can toggle off AI content because we don't promote slop in this house. I'm currently checking out Fallout Wasteland Wanderer, a solo role-playing game, but I've used DriveThruRPG in the past for Ashes Without Number and Twilight 2000. I don't just write ranty videos on YouTube, I am a huge world-building geek, and honestly, I don't know what I'd have done without DriveThruRPG, as I love using tabletop character and world creation tools as a bit of inspiration and structure for brainstorming. There are literally thousands of titles available, ranging from big names you'll know all the way to tiny niche indie titles. There's also a great selection of pay what you want and free options with plenty of hidden gems worth checking out. Make sure they know that I sent you by using the link in the video description or going to billpaid.me/drivethrurpg. That's billpaid.me/drivethrurpg.